Hello and welcome to episode 69 of A Plain Accounts podcast series, where every week we get together to discuss the gospel lection that the lectionary provides for this upcoming Sunday. Today, as always, I'm joined with my partner in crime, Danny Quanstrom. Danny, you want to say hi?
Hello, hello, hello.
Hello. We are honored to have Scott Savage, our commentator for the gospel passage, Matthew 9:35 through 10, verse 8 today. Scott, would you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, I'm Scott Savage. I'm a husband to Katie, who was just on not too long ago, and a couple of kids. Yeah, and I'm a pastor, senior pastor of Santa Monica Nazarene. I don't say the pastor, like that's special. I'm like, we have a part-time associate pastor, so I do a lot of work. But yeah, I've been here for almost 3 years, and into my 4th year, and loving it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your work on A Plain Accounts commentary, and I appreciate you being here today.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to jump right into the gospel lection for this coming week, and we're going to look at Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 going to chapter 10, all the way to verse 23. So let me get started in reading that aloud for us to put our conversation in the lens of the passage today. Matthew 9, starting at verse 35. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his field harvest." Moving on to Matthew chapter 10, starting with verse 1. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddaeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: "Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven is come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts. No bag for the journey, or extra shirt, or sandals, or a staff. For the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly, I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what you will say or how to say it. At the time, you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Holy Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Sounds like a fun thing that Jesus is calling us to as disciples.
Right.
Well, there is a lot of complexity, a lot of things that are going on here. I think as we begin to discuss this passage, putting it into the lens of Jesus just finishing the Sermon on the Mount, and then he's going in and embodying this message in the last few chapters. And in Matthew 9, it sounds like he's calling the disciples to join in that mission that he's already embodying and has preached on the Sermon on the Mount. Would that be an adequate start to looking at this chapter?
Yeah. I mean, that's the larger context is, I think it's 4:23, I think is where it shifts. There's some language there that resonates with chapter 9. He comes back to it, and then you go see him in his mission, in his ministry. One of the things, I mean, I'll just kind of start in with a couple of thoughts that I find interesting about what he calls them to. I mean, one of the hard parts for me about this passage is that it seems very specific, and nothing that any churches, at least in North America, ever do. we never go like this.
Right.
And so one of the questions I sort of have is, well, how do you read a passage like that? What is Jesus calling them to, and how do we read that today? So I kind of live within that flow and tension. And so I kind of think that Jesus has set up a big picture early on. There's that passage where in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, like the light has come to the Gentiles. And then he calls his disciples to go to Israel specifically, and no Gentiles. And I think that's a very specific call for them. So I think that's something I would want to point out early on, just about what's happening here, is that he's doing a very specific thing. And then anything we sort of read from that for our context today need to sort of come from that specific context. So it's kind of my first thought in that vein.
In what way should we unpack that specificity with the call to Israel and not to the Gentiles? Because as Danny mentioned before, we just came out of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit led to not only Jews but the Gentiles. I mean, for the entire world. So how do we put that in proper light for our congregations?
Yeah, I mean, I really like, I put N.T. Wright's quote in here that in my commentary, that Christ does for Israel what they couldn't do for themselves. And so that concept of fullness, or fulfilling the law that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, becomes really important. That Israel has to be Israel first in order for the blessing to go to the nations, And so Jesus does that. And when we go, post Pentecost, where we're starting to sort of think about life in the Spirit as the church, we go back and remember that what that means comes from this fullness of the who Israel is supposed to be, and Jesus specifically as that fullness. And so I think we go back and look at some of the specific situation in which he goes to minister to Israel, partly to hope, maybe to hope that they actually do it.
Right.
They actually be who they're called to be. Maybe, I don't know, I don't want to read Jesus into Jesus's like psychological makeup, but maybe with this sort of expectation that he kind of knows they won't. But he still he
kind of says that, right? Like, go, and if they receive you, bless them. But if they don't, shake the dust.
Yeah.
He seems much more confident that they're going to persecute you. You will be dragged before councils.
Which, and one of the things I think that's really important is that the reception of the good news that the kingdom of God has come, because that's what they're told to go proclaim, right? Go proclaim that the kingdom of God has drawn near. The reception of that is not their responsibility.
Right.
Like, they're told to go and tell people, and some people will receive it and some people won't, which I think that's really hard for us to hear.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's hard for North American Christians who have so often turned people into projects and like, I've got to get these people saved, right? Well, and what type of a rejection it feels like when they don't receive that which we offer to them. But Jesus says, shake the dust.
Yeah.
That's a tough thing for this North American Christian to grasp.
Right. Yeah. And and then if you think about it, like the way we structure our churches, like you said, the way we approach people or ministry, everything is sort of geared towards the bottom line.
Right.
Like the life of the church exists for that bottom line, rather than the life of the church sort of is regardless of who responds, which is weird to say. So if nobody responds, do you still have a common life that reflects the kingdom by the way y'all relate to each other within your own life, you know? I was thinking about this just to throw a movie into the mix because that helps me process. You guys have seen Of Gods and Men? That
Civil War movie?
No. This one is about the Algerian monks.
Oh.
Yeah. It's a really interesting, so it's based on a true story of Algerian monks who, spoiler alert, were, in case anybody wants to pause right now, they were killed when an Algerian civil war, kind of internal conflict in the Muslim community in 1996 spread out. And so these French monks they had a monastery in Algeria.
Oh, I have seen that.
Yeah. And one of the things that struck me about this movie that's really kind of hit home with me is that they have this life of farming, and there's a doctor, and they make honey, and like they do this thing and they pray. Everything's ordered around their prayer. And they're not like outright sort of evangelizing the way we would think they would or should in America, but they just have this life and they interact. They go to birthday parties in their neighborhood. There's a lady who is getting she's trying to figure out if the guy that her parents wanted to marry, it's a Muslim community, if that's the guy she wants to marry. And so this Muslim woman is asking the priest about love, and it gives him an opportunity to say why he became a priest, which was his sort of marital love devotion to God. And it was just this beautiful sort of presentation of a I don't know what the word is, not ulterior motive, but this sort of like, she's not a project for this guy. Like he loves her and he shares his faith, and both of those things are the truth. And so that, for me, if anybody wants to watch it, the first 15 or 20 minutes is just sort of laying this out, and you're just watching it before you even hear about the trauma or the problems going on. And you're like, this is like a beautiful image of the church. And so I thought about that sort of in light of this passage too, that they sort of have this task, and regardless of what happens, they're there to pray and to be present.
Right. Which I think there's an ecclesiological conversation that we could have that would be phenomenal, but perhaps beyond the scope of this podcast, about the church as monastic community.
Yeah, sure.
Which would that the church was an alternative way of being in this world within our communities, rather than kind of a poor reflection of the world around us.
Yeah.
I think one of the strong pictures that we get from that ecclesial picture with the monastic community is the fact that there is still dust on the disciples' feet. The reason why dust would be there is because the standard hospitality of the day was not recognized. They did not invite them into their house and wash their feet, and have them at the table. So those relationships were not being built.
Right.
So they kicked the dust off their feet, not in a way of casting rejection or judgment on the town, but that, okay, the vengeance is God's. Like we're going to give that over to God, kick the dust off of our feet, and move on to the next town, hoping for that deep, compassionate relationship.
Right.
Yeah. So can we speak a little bit about the compassion that Jesus has at the beginning of this text, and how that frames maybe this ecclesial call?
Yeah, so I want to look at that a little bit. first of all, I think this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but I think one of the things that's important is verse 36, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion on them because they were wandering. And then he turns to his disciples and says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And I think it's important to note the audience. Like, he has compassion for the crowd and then turns to his disciples and says, look at these folks. We've got to do something about it. Which I think, when I think about how the church looks at the crowd, I don't know that we're moved with compassion as much as we are impatience and anger and disgust. Like, how often do we look at the world? Do we look at the crowd within our towns or our cities and we say, oh, those people are just terrible. Look at how they live their life.
Right.
What is our initial response? I want to know what's our response to the crowd. Is it that of Christ, or is it that of judgment and condemnation?
Right. I mean, that's a really good question. And to me, it gets at the heart of so much of the disunity. Is that the right way to say it? Disunity of the church.
Sure.
This is where I usually come in these conversations. We don't agree on that. Like, Jesus says, the crowd. What was the phrase?
Jesus
were harassed.
They were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd.
Right. So nobody questions that sort of, if you want to call that a sociological description.
Right.
Nobody's questioning that, but we question what harassed and helpless looks like.
Right.
So some of us say this is what harassed and helpless looks like, and we have compassion and we need to suffer for it. And there's judgment is a whole other part of that. And then other people say this. And I think where I kind of wiggle in here is to say that, and I kind of mentioned it, not everything flies under the Christian banner. We can't. So sometimes when we talk about compassion and being there for people, we want to leave whatever that judgment question is. And I don't want to exclude that, but there is this thing of God's calling us to something, and some things don't form with that. If Christ is the shape and form of that, then it's a particular thing, not sort of universal open-ended thing. And I think sometimes I live with that tension of saying, well, I don't want to come across sounding mean like those Christians, but I also want to talk about form and shape and this pattern. And so there is this sense that we do need to be able to describe what a helpless, and I forget the phrase, helpless and harassed looks like. And I kind of broaden that concept probably a little bit more than the text is, but that's my struggle, I think, within that is how to talk about shaking the dust today, because the church is on the outside. If we're translating sort of Jesus sending Jews to go minister to Jews, right? Because that's what the disciples are doing. Into our context, it's a little bit different because we're not going to our own kind. Like if the world is the sort of those who are outside the church, then what is that? Is that the same thing, or does the dynamics change? You know, I see some of those things at work here, because I think a lot of our people will read one-to-one.
Sure.
And there might be some differences.
Right. There's not a direct correlation, right?
I don't know if I just brought in too much from what you were pointing towards.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all really helpful, and maybe each of us need to kind of define those categories in our contexts. But one of the things that, regardless of who that category is, I think we have to look at the compassion that Jesus has for them.
Yeah.
And we have to understand what he's saying there, which is a fun Greek word, which I don't know if I'm saying it right, but I've heard scholars say it a bunch of different ways. It comes from the word splagchisnomai, which is just a fun thing to say. I'll probably have the congregation say it with me on Sunday, splagchisnomai, because it's just fun to say. But it
make sure all the donut crusts are out of their teeth first.
Exactly. But we still have in English this word splonchnik, which is a medical term, and it deals with your innards, your intestines, your guts. And so splagchisnomai is a visceral reaction. I think when we read compassion, we've kind of reduced it to these feel good feelings or this kind of sympathy.
Right.
Where Christ isn't merely being sympathetic, where he's like, oh, I feel bad for them. Like, this is a gut reaction. He is moved into his bowels in compassion, in suffering with. And so there's this visceral gut reaction in Christ that leads him to say to his disciples, we can't do nothing.
Yeah.
We can't do nothing here. So I'm going to send you out.
Right. Which may be, pointing to, there are some things that do cross the boundaries, no matter where you come from. Like if you see somebody hungry, like that should make you feel something deep, those kinds of things. Yeah, for sure.
Which I want to know if, moving from kind of that first section to the next, he's got this compassion and then he sends the disciples out. But I think it's worth noting who these 12 apostles are. And I think it's worth noting we have to maybe define apostles as properly. And you wrote about this in the commentary, Scott. The proper Jewish understanding of an apostle was one who was sent on behalf of someone else, right?
Yeah.
It was somebody who could speak instead of someone else. And so these are those, which, I mean, there's incredible implications there that Christ sent these out as apostles, not just as messengers, right? Like he said, you are my presence in these places, which that in and of itself can preach, but I think we're often scared to take on that responsibility of being Christ in this apostolic manner to our world, to our communities. Right. It's incredible to me that in the section immediately after this, Jesus says the slave is not above the master, the master is not above the slave, and the teacher is not greater than the student. And so that's he says that after he sends out the disciples, saying, you are co-partners in ministry with me, which there's something incredible in that Christ has invited us into that. But then, Scott, could you talk for a minute about who these apostles are and why it's important who they are?
Yeah. I mean, the two that stood out to me that I mentioned, excuse me, are Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. You can't find two more polar opposite people,
right?
Number one, not just to like be in the same room and be like, we're sort of fringe members of the church, but like apostles. Like they're both called to be representatives of Jesus, and so
why would that matter? Why the Zealot and Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector? Why would that be a big deal?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wrote it here. Like the tax collectors were hated. Jewish tax collectors, people like Zacchaeus, were hated by the Jews because they were in collusion with Rome. I mean, they collected money from their own people and gave it to the empire, and so they were sellouts. And zealots were sort of the enemies of Rome. I mean, they were looking for the revolution, right? The uprising that would tear down the empire. And so one is working for the government and one wants to tear down the government.
But they're both apostles.
But they're both apostles. And again, like, I think it's not that. I think what's interesting is how that the interplay between those two different kinds of people come up in the contact with Jesus. And so they're pulled into his pattern, and the both of them can be there. It's because it's not like they just stay where they are,
right?
Like they're brought into the pattern of Jesus's life, but they're also kind of who they are.
Right.
And you don't hear much about whether or not they kept doing those things. Like we don't really know. But they're called that. They're described as that's part of their identity. And yet they're both allowed to be there. They're both allowed to be representatives. They're both sent in the trajectory that Jesus is laying down, I mean, one of the things I do too, which we don't have to like dive into too much, but I just kind of tried to make some contemporary examples of what those kinds of people would be for us today. Because I think that's the real question. I don't know that we as a church know how to, certainly not the Church of the Nazarene, maybe probably broader as well, know how to live with those kinds of tensions very well. We go to different churches. We don't worship together.
Yeah.
And if we do, it's really, really difficult to talk honestly about where we're coming from and how we see things to each other.
So kind of thinking out loud here with a very specific mission that Jesus is sending his disciples on. You will go speak to Israel, not the Gentiles. He doesn't seem to be very specific in who he's sending. Like, he's not sending people who are super united, like everyone's a zealot or everyone's a tax collector. These seem to be polar opposites in who he's sending. So what sort of things do we need to think about in that regard?
Yeah. Well,
I think there's some pastoral implications here, like in terms of leadership in the church even.
Sure. Do you mean in terms of like how we go about telling, discipling people into like a bigger picture?
Yeah, I think we tend to ask those who are like us to be partners in ministry with us. But Jesus called people who were not like each other to be partners in ministry together.
Right. That's a good point. Because we want people we can work with.
Right. I want somebody that's as a lead pastor, I want somebody who's going to get on board with the vision that I believe God has laid out as I haven't understood it.
Yeah.
But Jesus sends Simon and Matt together.
Yeah. I mean, and both of those things are valid too, because you don't want to blow the whole ship up, and yet, you do want that variety. I mean, just certain people know how to talk to certain people. You know, you can't witness to everyone. I think in my commentary, I kind of juxtaposed Paul's being all things to all people with, I mean, is the church even able to be something to these people? Like, we try to do everything, but it's like, can you even do one thing? Like, let's just like, it's one of the questions we're asking in our church, even in these few years, is what a sort of corporate identity looks like. So I talk a lot about just the people you're with and around and your sort of personal evangelism, but our bigger conversations are about that sort of corporate identity. Like when people think of us in Santa Monica, like, do we have like a specific sort of thing that we're concerned with, our hearts are breaking for in our neighborhood, that we could say we do actually kind of find the what's the list of things that he calls them to go with, no money, no silver, or tunics, or no bag, no or one tunic, no extra sandals, like that kind of thing. Like, do we line up our resources around a specific thing? Because that's what we're called to do.
And that's such an interesting component to me, as I said before the episode, that we're called to not put parameters on how the message will be received, but also on how we will be cared for. To the beginning of this mission for the disciples is to submit themselves to being served by the people of that village. Like that goes hand in hand with how they're going to present the gospel to them, this good news, this truth. In my context in Boise, in thinking about how diverse the disciples are, part of my heart is to try to join even with other expressions of Christianity in the valley to serve the poor. Because, like, imagine if we were all unified together, even in spite of our theological differences. We can continue talking about that, but what if that was in conjunction with going hand in hand and serving the poor, the broken, those who are harassed, in the valley? And it's pretty stark and obvious to me. Like, it just cracks me up so much that non-denominational, I get the most flack from them for being a part of a denomination. And I don't hear anyone in my denomination knocking, non-denominational in my valley, but I get the most flack from them, like, because they feel like we're rigid and legalistic.
Right.
They are then rigid and legalistic back to us, which is hilarious to me, because it's like you're kind of living counter into why you exist in the first place. And non-denominational is just a denomination calling them non-denominational. It's really funny to me that they'll allow that sort of thing to separate the mission. Like, can't we join in the mission even though we may come from different backgrounds? And so it's very my deep desire is to have that compassion be what drives us in our conversations. Can we disagree even like a Christian? Like, can we
Right.
disagree and have those conversations like a Christian, as we're going to serve these who are oppressed and harassed?
Right. Yeah.
So I think we're kind of coming close to the time here. How do we preach it?
It's never enough time.
Not enough time. So, I mean, what are some handles that we can use to make this appropriate in our context?
Yeah. I mean, I think like you brought up, exploring the larger picture of compassion, angling in on that is a great way to approach this text. Thinking about where brokenness is, just sort of generally, learning how to name it might be a way to approach this. I think the Matthew and Simon, is it Matthew and Simon contrast is a great approach. I mean, it's kind of fun. Like, if you know how to kind of work that in a humorous way, you could really get into the tensions in your church, like learn to bring it up,
Right.
Air it out a little bit. If it stays closed off, it festers, but
Right.
learn how to talk about it and laugh at ourselves a little bit.
Absolutely.
Is probably two good ways to start.
One thing I'm thinking of is in Michigan, you may have heard just this week, there was it wasn't really a raid as much as there was kind of the detaining of about 100 Caledonians, and a majority of them are Christian. And they were detained because most of them had a misdemeanor from decades ago, and a lot of them were born in the United States from their parents, obviously by their parents who had fled from Iraq and had never been registered but had lived here. And there are about 100 who have been detained to be sent back to Iraq. And I when I think of naming the harassed and the helpless, I think of this group of Christians who are being sent to a land where they've been told you will be persecuted or killed if you're a Christian. The population has shrunk from about 340 churches to 40 churches in Iraq from this particular church group, and there are imams that have stated explicitly that there will be persecution and troubles. And so when I think of that, I mean, I think of these Christians in Detroit who are looking at being exported to Iraq. And within my congregation, I will have folks who have voted for President Trump and those who voted against President Trump and any policies that he might have. But it seems to me that Christ is advocating an alternative kingdom here, that both the tax collector and the zealot have been called to and have been called away from their alternative kingdoms. Right. So I think one of the ways we could preach this is to preach people into the kingdom of God rather than the kingdoms that we find ourselves within, and advocating for those who might be harassed and helpless, whoever they may be. But then with that, I think another thing to note is that what Jesus does when he sends them, we've kind of talked about this, but regarding how to preach this, Jesus doesn't send them with cash. And he doesn't send them with supplies. So like part of our Epicurean, we Epicureans would say, well, what's the point? How am I going to solve this?
This doesn't sound fun. Why do I want to spend my time doing this?
Right. And so like, doesn't sound great. But then we're so practical, right? Like, so what good is this going to do? How is it going to help? I don't have any money. I don't have any supplies. How can I go help the harassed and helpless, the sheep without a shepherd, if I don't have anything? And it seems to me like the thing that Jesus provides them with is presence. Right. To cure the sick, to care for these, he's not buying them meals. He's providing them with presence, and that is a bit more difficult. Yeah. Because then we're asked to give of ourselves, not to give of our means.
Right. It also changes expectations like what success looks like, you know. Like churches are always asking sort of what does a good day look like for us, you know, how do we define those sort of metrics? And like these metrics are, if they welcome you, then that's good. If they don't, that's also part of the expectation. And so it's your response sort of within that is to move on, right? So he's laying down a different set of expectations for them. I think one interesting thing just within the story that you just told about the detainees, you know, what does it look like? What does presence look like? You know, one way to do it is to go advocate, legislate, change laws. You know, that's one way presence could be lived out. Another way is to name it, you know. I think to help people just see what's going on. You know, I think of really shaping for me was Kavanaugh's Torture in Eucharist at the end, where he talks about the movements that happened in Latin America, where they would go stand outside government buildings and read names of people who were kidnapped or whatever, and just to say that you can't make them disappear. We remember, you know. You know, I'm one of my heroes right now is a guy named William Stringfellow, who's a guy I'm doing some work on him, and you know, his sort of attitude of dissension towards the status quo makes you just sort of always not necessarily expect to change the status quo, but to just always call it into question. That's kind of maybe the Christian's task in the world, is to constantly call the status quo into question. And one of the ways we do that is to go be present in a way that makes people either receive us or not, but you sort of have to decide. And maybe one of the problems with the church is that we think of our presence as nothing that really needs to be rejected, because it's kind of bland to begin with. There's no real call to discipleship, and I'll throw myself and our church under that same sort of critical light as well. Like I constantly think about what that looks like, and are we worth considering? Is there actually something substantial enough that would be good news for people, or not, but they would know?
Absolutely. I think that's a good word. There's so much here in this passage that sometimes the tendency is to be overwhelmed by the breadth of what could be preached from this passage. And so I think one of the challenges is to select something that will speak into your context, just as Jesus is speaking into his right now. And this passage lends itself, as you said in your commentary, Scott, for the preacher to play with this text in a way that will profoundly impact their congregation. So perhaps that's our encouragement for our listeners today, is to select from what you have heard today and what you read in the passage, select something that will speak profoundly into your context to encourage the disciples to go and be a bold representation of Christ in their community. I can't get away. Recently I did a word study on presence, and it's the same word in Hebrew for face. So the presence of God is equal to seeing the face of God, the very presence of God. And so when we are trying to have the presence of Christ in our lives and the presence of Christ in other people, we are the face of Jesus. So will we be recognized as Jesus when we are present with the broken and the harassed in our world?
Never underestimate the power of a good play on words for preaching too.
Amen. Well, Scott, thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you.
Danny, do we have any words from our sponsors, or any updates that you'd like to share before we conclude?
I will just say this. There is a little Easter egg on the website. There is a newly added and secret link. And if you find it, you might just find some really cool new stuff at A Plain Account that's in the works, that is currently being built on the back end. So there's one little link. If you can find it, you can find the new developments going on at aplainaccount.org.
Nice. Also, if you're lamenting the end of the Easter season, you can
There you go. You can find an Easter egg. Yeah.
That's hilarious. And if you find the hidden link, you get a free high five from us when we see you. So.
Exactly.
All right. Well, go and preach boldly this week. We hope that this is always a service to you. These conversations are so important to our individual preaching as well. So we hope that it is a service to you this week. Go and preach boldly, and we will see you next week. Go in peace.